Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and this will be the final lecture, the final session on this novel. So we're looking at the section where Septimus Smith kills himself. So obviously we're seeing how he suffers some trauma, he's come back from the war, and he experiences PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But obviously at that point in time, the doctors have no knowledge of this, and they have no idea how to cure him. So they subject him to different kinds of things, which includes confinement, coercion, and basically bullying of a certain kind. So we can see how the biopolitics in Mrs. Dalloway is quite interesting. That's why it qualifies as a very, very complex novel in a course like Trauma and Literature. Now, this section, which should be on the screen now towards the end of the novel, because this is the final session for this text, where Septimus is still seeing Evans, and we see how Evans as a character is important. We talked about the very interesting relationship between materiality and spectrality in this novel, and Evans is obviously a spectral presence. He's there, and he keeps coming back as some kind of a traumatic reputation, a spectral reputation, but at the same time, he's very much a character in the novel, despite not being physically present. He's been killed in the war, we know that. He died in the war, but then his memory, his traumatic memory, keeps coming up and keeps resurfacing in Septimus's brain, and that obviously corroborates and further accentuates his traumatic and paranoid condition, the condition of shock. So this is a section on your screen where he says, "Evans," he cried. There was no answer. A mouse had squeaked, or a curtain rustled. Those were the voices of the dead. The screen, the coal scuttle, the sideboard remained to him. Let him then face the screen, the coal scuttle and the sideboard. But Rezia burst into the room chattering. So, we can see how Septimus's isolation begins to sort of consume him in a way, and he's looking at a blank screen and is projecting his fears, his fantasies, his hallucinations onto that screen. And you can see Evans, but then there are other noises around him, and everything else seems invasive to him. The normal world around him, the quote-unquote normal world around him, seems very, very invasive to him. It's sort of attacking him, and he feels attacked all the time. The doctors seem to attack him, all the people around him seem to attack him. So he has this paranoid condition where he experiences hostility from everyone, and he perceives that everyone's presence as a hostile presence. So his isolation becomes his companion, and this is a classic case of trauma where you cannot connect to the world around yourself. And as I mentioned in one of my earlier sessions, the entire novel may be seen as a crisis in embodiment. And by embodiment, of course, we're talking about the very biological, neural quality of behaving through a neural mechanism, but also embodiment as an extended phenomenon, something which helps you to connect to the environment around yourself. So this constant loop between the inside and the outside, between the embedded quality and the extended quality, is what makes embodiment a process, an activity. It's not really a static thing. It's an activity, a constant process of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming. Now that quality of embodiment is interrupted in Septimus. We're talking about how Septimus he suffers some interrupted embodiment, right? There's a disruption in his embodiment because the world he wants to connect to no longer exists. I mean, there's a dead world. He sees dead people, he sees hallucinations, and a world that is around him as a physical reality. He cannot seem to connect to that. So there's this constant disconnect that he's experiencing, which makes it such a profoundly complex novel from the perspective of trauma studies. So Rezia bursts into the room chattering. So Rezia's presence, although Rezia is this loving wife, and we can see how Rezia's isolation is also very, very complex, but that presence becomes intrusive for Septimus. It bothers him. Some letter had come. Everyone's plans were changed. Mrs. Filmer would not be able to go to Brighton after all. There was no time to let Mrs. Williams know. And really, Rezia thought it very, very annoying when she caught sight of the hat and thought perhaps she might take a little. Her voice died out in a contented melody. "Oh, damn," she cried. It was a joke of theirs, her swearing. The needle had broken, hat, child, Brighton needle. She built it up, first one thing, then another. She built it up sewing. So she's sewing something, and this breaking of the needle becomes a very symbolic thing, because that sort of anticipates the break of Septimus in a way, because sewing something is constructing something, creating something. So she's building a hat, presumably for Septimus, with a needle, but then suddenly the needle breaks, and that becomes a symbolic break, because that anticipates the final break, the final annihilation that comes with Septimus's suicide. She wanted him to say whether by moving the rows she had improved the hat. She sat on the end of the sofa. So as we can see that she, like a normal person, she's trying to engage with the little things, making a hat, sewing something, the needle. These things, these materials around her, seem to make a lot of meaning, seem to make her meaningful existence. But for Septimus, these things are completely meaningless because he's constantly connected to his past, his traumatic past, and his normal present has no meaning for him at all whatsoever. Right? So there's this constant disconnect they're suffering as a couple. And we have this ironic sentence right after this where the narrator is saying, they were perfectly happy now, she said, suddenly putting the hat down. So suddenly she is trying to be happy. She's trying to find some happiness out of this entire condition. The hat, the sewing needle, etc. For she could say anything to him now. She could say whatever came into her head. That was almost the first thing she had felt about him that night in the cafe. So you have this backstory now about where they first met, presumably during the war. The first night in the cafe where he had come in with his English friends. He had come in rather shyly, looking around him, and his hat had fallen when he hung it up. That she could remember. She knew that he was English, though not one of the large Englishmen her sister admired. But he was always thin, but he had a beautiful fresh color. And with his big nose, his bright eyes, his way of sitting a little hunched made her think she had often told him of a young hawk. That first evening she saw him when they were playing dominoes, and he had come in of a young hawk. But with her, he was always very gentle. So we can see how Septimus's masculinity is interesting. It doesn't seem to correspond to this big, bulky masculinity, which is normally associated with the military men. But he seems to be rather a shy person, an inward-looking person, an introspective person, and that, of course, becomes a problem. I mean, the doctors keep telling him that if you introspect too much, if you think about yourself too much, then you become melancholic. So, the thoughtlessness of military masculinity is completely in contrast to Septimus's introspective masculinity, which makes them look different in Rezia's eyes. So there's a bunch of Englishmen coming in, presumably all military men. But Septimus stands out in Rezia's perception because he's a shy, inward-looking person who reminds her of a hawk, not like a big, bulky man, but a hawk. So gently watching things, observing things, right? So this gentle quality of Septimus is what attracted Rezia to him, and which is what it becomes a problem for him subsequently, because he's too gentle, too sensitive, and the sensitivity is a problem for the doctors. And again, we're looking at this interesting collusion between military masculinity and medicine, where being sturdy, being robust is a big thing, is a good thing, and being sensitive is a bad thing. It's almost a effeminate thing to be sensitive. So sensitivity emasculates you, according to the doctors over here. So they constantly try to coerce Septimus into not being sensitive, into being outward looking, play cricket, be a Boy Scout, etc. Okay. So with her, he was always very gentle. She had never seen him wild or drunk, only suffering sometimes through this terrible war. But even so, when she came in, he would put it all away. So again, this wild drunkenness, which is again normally associated with military masculinity, was entirely absent in Septimus. So she had never seen him. So this is a very interesting and important passage because it gives us a backstory about Septimus. It gives us a backstory about how they met, Septimus and Rezia, and how they connected, and also tells us about the character of Septimus to a certain other person. And this is what we call in literature or literary studies as focalization. The entire description of Septimus is focalized through Rezia's eyes. So Rezia is the focalized character through which we get to know Septimus's character. So Septimus's personality, his embodiment, his behavior, etc. They all come to the fore because of the way Rezia is perceiving him. Right? So, and that gives us sort of a description of his masculinity in a certain sense. Okay, so anything in the whole world, any little bother with her work, anything that struck her to say, she would tell him, and he understood at once. So this whole idea of understanding everything Rezia wanted to say, obviously means there was a lot of empathy between Septimus and Rezia, because at a certain level both were outsiders, right? And they connected to each other as outsiders, right? So Rezia comes to London as an Italian girl. So she feels like an outsider. Septimus comes back to England after the war, and he cannot connect to the post-war civilian space. So he's an outsider as well. So the very inception of the relationship is through empathy, through this connect. And that becomes ironic because, At this point in time, they seem to have a complete disconnect with each other because Septimus' medical, mental condition, right? So the mental health of Septimus, the traumatic condition of Septimus is what sort of undercuts his personality to a certain extent. So the Septimus of Rezia knew has completely disappeared, right? But this is a backstory from which we are told that Septimus and Rezia connected to each other in very empathic ways, right? So the empathy was a very crucial category in the relationship. It sort of intensified the relationship. So he understood her at once. Her own family even were not the same. Being older than she was and being so clever, how serious he was, wanting her to read Shakespeare before she could even read a child's story in English. Being so much more experienced, he could help her, and she too could help him. So, they were both needy characters. They both required rescuing of a sort. So Rezia wanted to escape her family who did not understand her, and Septimus wanted to escape his sort of military condition. So they're both connected to each other in interesting ways. And again, you can see how Septimus is encouraging Rezia to read Shakespeare. And that's not something you should normally expect from a military officer, reading Shakespeare. What you do expect normally is getting wild or getting drunk. But Septimus was able to that. He was reading poetry, he was reading Shakespeare. And you can think, those of you who have read the war poets, Suzanne, Owens, we find that, these are people, the problem with these war poets that they carried on this romantic sensibility in the war, and that made them very different from the kind of masculinity which is normally associated with the military. So they were sensitive people. So and they wrote poetry. Wilfred Owen, for example, wrote poetry about hallucination, about melancholia, about the guilt, about survivor's guilt, etc., which obviously meant that the sensitivity of these men were completely anathema to the thoughtlessness of the war. Right? So we're looking at two kinds of masculinity, thoughtless masculinity and thoughtful masculinity. And the thoughtlessness is something which is encouraged, not just in military discourse, but also by the medical practitioners. So people like Holmes and Bradshaw tell Septimus to think as little as possible, right? Because thinking will be a problem. Introspection will be a problem, because the moment you think, the moment you realize the futility of the war. And some of you may have read a lot of poetry of around the First World War, and a recurrent theme in those poems is the idea of futility. Why are we fighting this war at all? Why are we killing the enemy? Who is the enemy, right? So, Strange Meeting by Wilfred Owen, of futility. So these are poems which talk about the very sort of abundant condition of human existence, where people are just fighting each other without any reason, they don't quite know. And the moment you think about it, the moment you realize how purposeless the entire spectacle of war is. And that becomes the problem for the military, because you have to go and fight your enemy, you have to kill your enemy without thinking about it. Right? So the thoughtfulness of Septimus and the thoughtlessness of the war are sort of contrasted with each other in interesting ways. And again, as I mentioned, Rezia's perspective is helping the readers, getting a backstory about Septimus. Okay, but this hat now, and then it was getting late, Sir William Bradshaw. So, you can see the craft of Virginia Woolf in terms of how she's using a symbol of the hat to connect the past and the present. Because, Rezia's first experience with Septimus, when they all came into this public space, a social space, and he kept his hat somewhere in a hat stand, and that hat had fallen. And that has become a memory in Rezia's mind, Septimus's fallen hat, that hat that fell from his head. And in a certain sense, he had identified the fallen hat with Septimus. And now she's sewing another hat for him, which is incomplete. And again, the incompletion of the hat is symbolic. It means this is incomplete recovery of Septimus. He will never get back to the original hat. Right? So the present hat will never get back to the original full hat. So the fullness of Septimus will never be recovered in a certain sense. And now we have another hat coming up, Sir William Bradshaw. So this is a scene, the final scene, not the final scene, but the suicide scene of Septimus, which culminates the entire medical drama and the existential crisis in the novel. And then it was getting late, Sir William Bradshaw. The doctor is marching up the stairs. She held her hands to her head, waiting for him to say, did he like the hat or not? And as she sat there waiting, looking down, he could feel her mind, like a bird, falling from branch to branch, and always alighting, quite rightly. He could follow her mind, as she sat there in one of those loose, lax poses that came to her naturally. And if he should say anything, at once she smiled, like a bird alighting with all his claws firm upon the bough. So, as some of you know, a major marker of 20th century fiction, especially modernist literature, what we qualify what we consider as modernist literature as stream of consciousness. And we can see how the thought processes are sort of described in graphic details. And the metaphor of the bird is interesting. It's like how a bird flows from one branch to another branch. In a very similar way, the sense perceptions are flowing from one point to another point. So we have a very fluid perception mechanism at work, which is described as a narrative category in this novel. So as you find, I mean, if you read almost all the major works of modernist literature in English, the event that happens in those novels are in the head of the characters. The event is a consciousness. So consciousness becomes a character, an event. So the entire flow of consciousness, the fluidity of consciousness, that itself becomes something of a plot in those novels. So we can see how something is happening, something similar is happening here as well. When Rezia is sitting, Septimus is looking at her, that's the entire event. What we get to see from a very graphic description of the thought processes of the characters flowing from one point to another point. Okay. But he remembered Bradshaw Bradshaw had said this before. The people we are most fond of are not good for us when we are ill. Bradshaw said he must be taught to rest. Bradshaw said they must be separated. So we can see how this coercive strategy of the doctors becomes brutal away. So the doctors apparently think that people who love you should not be allowed to come to you during your recovery period. So they must be separated. Septimus and Rezia must be separated according to that medical principle that they're practicing that point of time. So we can see how the medicine around Septimus, the medical culture around Septimus, is very anti-empathy, is very anti-sentiment, very anti-emotion. It just looks at a patient as an object, as an instrument that needs to be corrected, that needs to be cured in a very hardwired kind of a way. So there is no attention given to emotion, there's no attention given to empathy, there's no attention given to care. It's all about objectifying the patient as an instrument that needs repair, right? So especially a male instrument like Septimus is a military man who must be repaired, who must be made functional again, has become dysfunctional, so you must make it functional again. So the entire focus over here seems to be on functionality, seems to be on the sort of repairing strategy rather than any healing strategy, right? So the focus is not on healing, it's on repairing, and that obviously means it's a very different kind of medical discourse at work. He must be taught to rest. So again, look at the word must. There's a coercive quality about it. He must be taught to rest. So, and according to that principle, the people we are most fond of are not good for us when we are ill. So we must be separated from the people we love when we are ill. So again, the entire there's no acknowledgement at all. There's no emphasis at all on the idea of care, right? So caring is a bad thing. Emotion is a bad thing. Empathy is a bad thing, according to this particular medical discourse. So they are asked to rest. They are asked to separate from each other, and Septimus must be taught to rest. So must, taught. So these words obviously are the vocabulary of a coercive kind, right? And that's Septimus is thinking about that. Must. Why must? What power had Bradshaw over him? What right has Bradshaw to say must to me? He demanded. So this is a classic biopolitics at play, where the political and the biological, the medical, they sort of collude together, and where we can see medicine becoming powerful, medicine becoming an instrument of power, through which power controls its mechanism. So it is a very classic Michel Foucault kind of a condition where healing is less important, correcting is more important. So, we almost have a idea of a medical jail of a certain kind, where isolation is imposed on patients, where separation is imposed on patients. You must be confined to a chamber in the same way as you're confined to a prison cell, and you're not allowed to meet your loved ones. You're not allowed to have exercise any empathy of any kind. We're looking at a very interesting merging, shall we say, between the medical and a punitive of a certain kind. So it's almost like a medical jail, as I mentioned. So, you must be separated, you must be taught to rest, etc. So the word must obviously connotes power, connotes control, connotes coercion of a certain kind, right? And that's something Septimus is getting bothered by. It is because you talked of killing yourself, said Rezia. Mercifully, she could now say anything to Septimus, right? So, because you thought of killing yourself, so the doctor's saying you must be separated from me and you must be confined to a particular chamber. So he was in their power. Holmes and Bradshaw were on him. So again, we look at the entire territorial control of medicine. They are seizing him, they're controlling him. Holmes and Bradshaw are on him, right? The brute with the red nostrils was snuffing into every sacred place. So the brutality of the doctors, something which comes to Septimus's mind. So rather than cure or healing or empathy, the doctors symbolize brutality to him. Doctors symbolize lovelessness to him. It could say, where were his papers, the things he had written? So again, he's looking for his diary, he's looking for these passages he had written out of his mind, out of his melancholia, and he wants to rescue those. But then, of course, according to Holmes and Bradshaw, writing is a bad thing. If you're writing out your mind, that means you're getting more melancholic, you become more introspective. And the entire emphasis over here by the doctors is an anti-introspection, is an anti-melancholia, is an anti-sensitivity, right? So writing is a bad thing. You must be taught to rest, you must be exercising, you must be playing cricket. So as you can see, it's a very masculinist kind of medical discourse where you need to have a fit body. So anyone who's not fit is considered to be a problem, considered to be an aberration to the system. So the system will send its instruments to cure you, not so much to cure you, but to repair you. So the instrumentality of medicine is very, very evident over here. He must be taught to rest, he must be corrected in a certain sense. And Septimus, of course, is looking for his papers, his diary, places where he'd written down his passages, his secret passages, his melancholic passages, etc. And he's thinking of recovering those before the doctors get there. Okay, so where were his papers, the things he had written? She brought him his papers, the things he had written, things she had written for him. She tumbled them out of the sofa. They looked at them together, diagrams, designs, little men and women brandishing sticks for arms with wings. Were they? On the back, circles traced round shillings and sixpence. The suns and stars, zigzagging precipices with mountaineers ascending, roped together, exactly like knives and forks. Sea pieces with little faces laughing out of what might perhaps be waves. The map of the world. Burn them, he cried. Now for his writings, now the dead sing behind the rhododendron bushes. Odes to time, conversations with Shakespeare, Evans. His messages from the dead. Do not cut down trees. Tell the Prime Minister, universal love, the meaning of the world. Burn them, he cried. So this becomes a very classic Freudian scene in a certain sense, because he had drawn diagrams of his mind. And as you can see, if you study the diagrams, knives and forks, sea pieces with precipices, and people zigzag together, suns and stars. So it's a very, very paranoid kind of an architecture of a mind full of fear, a mind which is scared, nervous, neurotic. And those diagrams manifest that fear very, very clearly. But of course, to the doctors, these kind of doctors, those are completely meaningless. And then again, his passages about Shakespeare, his writings on Shakespeare, his writings on Evans, perhaps his love for Evans, as we have discussed at some point earlier, is never really spelled out what kind of love that was, whether it was homoerotic, whether it was purely platonic, whether it was, we know it's deeply emotional, but I don't quite know what exactly it was. So it's never spelled out. But these passages might contain some messages, might contain the secrets. So he wants to burn them. He doesn't want these to come in the hands of Holmes and Bradshaw. So again, we can see how medicine over here becomes an invasive instrument. It makes the entire human subject completely agency-less. It cuts down your agency, it cuts down your mechanism, it cuts down your mobility, it cuts down your freedom. You're not free to move, you're confined to a room, you're not allowed to write, and even the things you've written are seized from you, right? So he wants to burn everything he had written, he wants to burn everything he had drawn, and he's requesting Rezia to burn those. And this becomes the dramatic scene. But Rezia laid her hands on them. Some were very beautiful, she thought. She would tie them up, for she had no envelope, with a piece of silk. So she would connect all the dots together. She would connect all the drawings together, all the passages together with a piece of silk. So again, you can see the entire effort on the part of Rezia is to keep trying to connect, keep trying to integrate everything. And in that way, she's trying to address Septimus's disintegration, right? So you can see the symbolic things, like she wants to connect all the letters together with a piece of silk. And silk, obviously, it has a smooth, fluid quality. So again, the whole idea is to connect the dots in Septimus's mind, connects the disparate thought process in Septimus's mind, and in the process trying to integrate him back again into holistic, healthy self, right? With a lot of care. even if they took him, she said, she would go with him. They could not separate them against their wills, she said. So as you can see how the medical and the legal are colluding together, right? So the medical forces are coming in and they're instructing, they're ordering them to be separated from each other, and in the process they become, so the entire discourse becomes one of control and coercion rather than of empathy and care and love or affection. Shuffling the edges straight, she did up the papers and tied the parcel almost without looking, sitting beside him. He thought, as if all the petals were about her. She was a flowering tree, and through her branches looked out on the face of a lawgiver who had reached a sanctuary where she feared no one, not Holmes, nor Bradshaw, a miracle, a triumph, the last and the greatest. Staggering, he saw her mount the appalling staircase, laden with Holmes and Bradshaw, men who never weighed less than 11 stone 6, who sent their wives to court, men who made 10,000 a year and talked of proportion, who different in the verdicts. For Holmes said one thing, Bradshaw said another thing. Yet judges they were, who makes a vision and the sideboard, saw nothing clear, yet ruled, yet inflicted, must, they said, over them she triumphed. So you can see how there's a very male-female quality over here, which is operative. So Holmes and Bradshaw are big, bulky men who are very wealthy, very sturdy, very robust, who weigh a lot of, they weigh 11 stone 6, that's the measurement in Britain back in those days. Very heavy men, made a lot of money, sent the wives to court, had fancy parties at the homes, and then, they talked about proportion all the time, they talked about measurement all the time. So as you can see, the entire medical gaze that is operative over here is a quantifying gaze, is a measuring gaze. It just wants to cut down the human subject into a measurable object, right? Something which can have a proportion, something which can have a measurement, right? So there's no human agency, there's no human fluidity. They always talk about proportions. And the ironic thing is, as you can see, that they differ in their verdicts, they differ in their diagnosis about Septimus. So, and Holmes said something else, Bradshaw says something else, and yet they behave like judges. So this is what I meant when I said that there's a very clear collusion between medicine and the penal court over here, right? So they're almost like judges giving out verdicts, judging for you, deciding for you, penalizing you if you don't carry out the verdicts. So yet judges they were. They didn't see anything clear. They have no idea, no knowledge of what was really bothering Septimus, and yet they ruled, they inflicted, right? So they inflicted torture on Septimus. Must, they said, over them she triumphed. So she wants to beat them, she wants to triumph over them, she wants to take care of Septimus, and she's against Holmes and Bradshaw now. And you can see how Septimus and Rezia are sort of unifying in a very spiritual way at the end. But ironically, right before Septimus' suicide, they come together as husband and wife, as true loving male and females, coming together and resisting this march of this military men, the military medical men who are coming to take away Septimus, who are coming to seize Septimus, right? So the final unition, the final love, the final connect, the final empathy in the novel occurs in this section where Septimus and Rezia come together and tries to resist in futility because the doctors win, Septimus kills himself, but then they're trying to resist the march of the doctors, the march of the medical dictatorship, right, who will come in to control Septimus. There, she said, the papers were tied up. No one could get at them. She would put them away. And she said nothing should separate them. She sat down beside him and called him by the name of that hawk or crow, which being malicious and a great destroyer of crops was precisely like him. No one could separate them, she said. So you can see the bird metaphors are quite interesting. For some reason, Septimus keeps occurring in Rezia's mind as a hawk, as someone who destroys the crops, and that's a very interesting metaphor for someone she loves, right? At the same time, it also becomes a metaphor for resilience. It also becomes a metaphor for power, strength, right? So he'd be this hawk who would see everything, penetrate everything with his gaze, with his vision, and yet try to resist something which is trying to attack them in a certain sense, right? Then she got up to go into the bedroom to pack their things, but hearing voices downstairs and thinking that Dr. Holmes had perhaps called, ran down to prevent him coming up. So this is a very dramatic scene where Holmes is marching up the stairs and Septimus is in the bedroom upstairs, and Rezia is trying to get down the staircase, trying to intercept Holmes coming in, and he's pushing her away and trying to go to Septimus and seize him. And then, of course, the very tragic suicide happens. Septimus could hear her talking to Holmes on the staircase. "My dear lady, I have come as a friend," Holmes was saying. So you can see the sinister quality in Holmes's voice. "I come here as a friend." So obviously that kind of a voice has a very sinister, evil ring. That obviously means I'm come here to see Septimus, and that cold, clinical, sinister quality is what makes Septimus even more afraid of what he's saying. "No, I will not allow you to see my husband," she said. He could see her like a little hen with her wings spread, barring his passage, but Holmes persevered. So it is a classic male-female battle going on over here. And again, we can see the animal, the bird metaphors coming in. So she is this powerless hen. And this is where you can go back to the hawk metaphor and see how she had perceived Septimus to be the hawk, the protective bird, the powerful, the resilient bird, who's supposed to protect them, because she's a hen and she cannot protect them, physically speaking. But then the hawk is failing. The hawk has lost his vision. The hawk has lost his penetrative gaze. All right? And so both of them are now powerless against these forces which are coming up to seize them. But Holmes persevered. "My dear lady, allow me," Holmes said, putting her aside. Holmes was a powerfully built man. So again, the masculinity of Holmes is foregrounded away as a powerful, muscular man. And he's pushing her aside, and she's powerless as a hen against that. Holmes was coming upstairs. Septimus would burst. Holmes would burst open the door. Holmes would say, "In a funk, eh?" So funk obviously is a very derogatory slang word, which means you're in a mad state, you're in an insane state. In a funk is a vulgar word, a vulgar British word, which means you like this, in a crazy, disoriented state. In a funk, eh? So the very condescending, patronizing, derogatory, insulting tone of that medical gaze is quite evident over here. There's no care, no empathy, no healing mechanism at work, but a curative instrument has come to cure you, to correct you, to repair you. It's sort of looking down upon you for being dysfunctional in a certain sense. Holmes would get him, but no, not Holmes, not Bradshaw. Getting up rather unsteadily, hopping indeed from foot to foot, he considered Mrs. Filmer's nice clean bread knife with bread carved on the handle. But he mustn't spoil that. So again, look at the way in which this thought processes are operating. So he's thinking of killing himself. He first thinks of a knife, and then he thinks of Mrs. Filmer's bread knife with bread written on it. But then it's a good knife. He mustn't spoil that. So this is a classic stream of consciousness at work. So the consciousness is flowing from matter to matter, from point to point, and his thought processes are operating that way. It's a distributed cognition, along with an interiorized cognition. It's also distributed cognition. It's also being enacted with certain objects around him. So how would I kill myself? How would I commit a suicide? Through a knife? No, not through a knife. Through a gaslight? No. So he finally decides, he zeroes in, on the jumping thing. The gas fire, but it was too late. Now, Holmes was coming. Razias he might have got, but Rezia, who always did that sort of thing, had packed them because they were thinking of leaving together, almost like two lovers running away, and the agents, the brutal agents of a patriarchal society coming to separate them. So it almost becomes that kind of a scene over here. There remained only the window, the large Bloomsbury lodging house window, the tiresome, the troublesome, and rather melodramatic business of opening the window and throwing himself out. So, that's the only option left to kill himself. So he can't cut his throat with a knife, he can't put the gas fire, he can just jump from the window. That's the only option left. So, as you can see, the suicide of Septimus, in a certain sense, is an escape from the forces of medicine, the brutal forces of the medical machinery, but also in a paradoxical sense it becomes the final and extreme enactment of agency. That's the only agency he has, the refusal to give himself, to give his body to the doctors who have come to repair him, the resistance, the refusal, the rejection of the doctors, that is enacted to this extreme instance of suicide. So the suicide of Septimus is an extreme extension of agency, and that becomes the final rejection of the entire medical machinery around him. Okay, it was their idea of tragedy, not his or Rezia's, for she was with him. So again, we can see how there's a union between Rezia and Septimus over here. And he's saying, jumping from the window is tragic according to them, but according to me it's melodramatic, but then there's something else I can do now. Holmes and Bradshaw liked that sort of thing. He sat on the sill, but he would wait till the very last moment. He did not want to die. Life was good, the sun hot, only human beings. What did they want? Coming down the staircase opposite, an old man stopped and stared at him. Holmes was at the door. "I'll give it to you," he cried, and flung himself vigorously, violently, down onto Mrs. Filmer's area railings. So as you can see, it's a very, very tragic scene. He doesn't want to die. He's sitting on the sill and he gets a final experience of life. The sun was hot, life was good, everything was beautiful. He doesn't want to die. But why are human beings pushing me to die? So we can see how the entire scene becomes an extreme example of lack of human empathy. He tries to live, tries to love, and he and Rezia, as I mentioned, they finally come together as true man and woman, true husband and wife, in a union, in the resistance against the doctors, the medical machinery around them. And in Septimus' suicide becomes an act of triumph in a certain sense, a very extreme act of triumph, but then that's the only option he has left, according to him. And he waits till the last second, so as you can see that he's still hoping that he wouldn't have to jump, but then Holmes comes in the room and he jumps and he flings himself on the railings, and it's almost like a crucifixion in a certain sense. He crucifies himself, he jumps on the railings and he's sort of stuck to the railings as some kind of a Christ figure in the end, violently down to Mrs. Filmer's area railings, right? And as you can see, Septimus is named to, is a Jewish name, we're told at the beginning of the novel, so that too has a Christ-like character throughout this narrative. "The coward!" cried Dr. Holmes, bursting the door open. So as you can see, there's no note of tragedy in Dr. Holmes's voice. He's just admonishing Septimus for being a coward, for being unmanly. And the unmanliness of Septimus is sort of dramatized over here by Holmes. He's saying, you're a coward, you're a spineless coward, you're not manly enough, you could not face life, you could not face the doctors, you could not you cannot be cured or repaired, you die a dysfunctional man, so you're a coward. So as you can see, everything has a utility in this particular narrative, and according to Holmes and Bradshaw, every man must be purposeful, every man must have a function, every man must have some kind of a utility, and when you cross the utility, it must be repaired and made functional again. And Septimus's resistance to this kind of an instrument makes him a coward in Holmes's eye. Rezia ran to the window. She saw, she understood. That's a very crucial line. She understood. So she completely understands why Septimus killed himself. And this final understanding becomes the final union of Rezia and Septimus. She understands him, and finally someone understands him. So the understanding comes to him posthumously, right? It's only after he dies, Rezia understands exactly why he did that particular act. According to Holmes, he has no clue. He just thinks, this is an act of cowardice. Right, Dr. Holmes and Mrs. Filmer collided with each other. Mrs. Filmer flapped her apron and made her hide rise in the bedroom. There was a great deal of running up and down stairs. Dr. Holmes came in, white as a sheet, shaking all over, with a glass in his hand. "She must be brave and drink something," he said. What was it? Something sweet, for her husband was horribly mangled. Would not recover consciousness. She must not see him. Must be spared as much as possible. Would have the inquest to go through. Poor young woman. Who could have foretold it? A sudden impulse. No one was in the least to blame, he told Mrs. Filmer. And why the devil he did it, Dr. Holmes could not conceive. So Holmes comes in, shaking, he's nervous. He thinks Rezia is very nervous as well. He thinks Rezia must not see it because, it's too brutal a scene for a woman, because Rezia is this very soft woman, so he gives her something to drink. It seemed to her, as she drank the sweet stuff, that she was opening long windows, stepping into some garden. But where? The clock was striking 1, 2, 3. How sensible the sound was, compared with all this thumping and whispering, like Septimus himself. She was falling asleep, but the clock went on striking 4, 5, 6. And Mrs. Filmer, waving her apron, they wouldn't bring the body in here, would they? Seemed part of that garden or a flag. She had once seen a flag slowly rippling out from a mast when she stayed with her aunt in Venice. Men killed in battle were thus saluted, and Septimus had been to the war. Of her memories, most were happy. So I'll stop at this point, and this is I'll stop the session as well. So as we can see that Rezia's final thoughts as she sort of moves into sleep, or happy thoughts, happy memories. And this is a beautiful line which she says, "Of her memories, most were happy." Right? And the end of Septimus comes to her as a very romantic end. They're stepping into a garden, and some kind of a union metaphor at work. There's some kind of a idyllic landscape that she's moving into, she's walking into, and then she's thinking of an aunt in Venice, men kill in battle with this saluter, and Septimus had been through the war. So in some sense, she's saluting Septimus. So Septimus gets a posthumous recognition, a posthumous salute, a posthumous, acknowledgement of being the soldier, of her memories most were happy. Right, so as we can see, this is the final isolation in Rezia. She becomes lonely, she becomes completely disconnected, and everyone becomes patronizing to herself. But the final consciousness, her final thoughts are happy thoughts as she sort of moves into sleep. So we come to the end of Mrs. Dalloway, and then of course, if you read the novel, there's a social party at the end. Lots of people come. The Portuguese ambassador, the imperial officers, Peter Walsh, the imperial person, comes in. There's this entire scene where all the big socialites in London are hobnobbing together, but we can see how superficial that scene is, and the entire drama of socializing is a very superficial, fragile drama. And Septimus's fragility is a real condition of London. Septimus's vulnerability is a real traumatic condition of London, which everyone's trying to hide and conceal in the different ways. So the entire social party, the entire social mechanism of coming together and getting together becomes a compulsive and almost sort of paranoid attempt to look happy, look normal, look no matter. But then real London is a traumatized London, is a very heavily bombed London. And every memory is a memory of the war, and Septimus's death obviously corroborates the tragedy, corroborates a human tragedy where there's no empathy. The medical gaze is completely, it doesn't understand at all the human condition. So you have a complete, incompatibility between the medical gaze and the human condition, and the human emotion of trauma, the human emotion of loss and tragedy and sadness. The medical gaze cannot quantify that at all. So the entire novel becomes as I mentioned, an existential crisis, a crisis in embodiment, but also how the crisis is accentuated in a certain sense with the lack of empathy from the medical gaze. Right? So the medicine, the medical culture around that time was completely incompatible, was completely unprepared to treat this trauma of the First World War, and it wasn't equipped. It didn't have the vocabulary, it didn't have the training, and this was also a time in medical history where Freud became very important in London. Psychoanalysis became very important in London because that kind of treatment, it paid a lot of emphasis. It paid a lot of emphasis to dreams, to the subconscious, to storytelling. So to a psychoanalyst, Septimus's stories written on the piece of paper will be very, very important. That would be seen as some kind of a diagnosis, as some kind of a projection of the fear, and that would be used as a cure method rather than this coercive confinement and coercive separation that Holmes and Bradshaw subject them to. So the final bit of the novel is Peter Walsh meeting Clarissa Dalloway in a very, very superficial party where all the big socialites come, but then it's a very, that becomes very ironic because we see the real human tragedy underneath all that, and everything else just becomes a cover-up in London in a post-war metropolis where people are trying to look social and trying to look connected, where actually everyone is disconnected from everyone else. There's complete isolation and alienation, and Septimus's tragedy is an extreme example, a spectacular example of that alienation in this very, very tragic, traumatic world. So with this, we come to the end of Mrs. Dalloway. I hope you found this novel interesting. Do read it entirely. For the purpose of this course, we just read certain selected sections from the perspective of medical history, cognitive theory, trauma theory, etc. But it's a fascinating novel, and I do recommend you read it entirely. But we finish this at this point, and from the next session, we move on to a different text. Thank you for your attention.